Hi, Dylan. Jimmy Dore, how are you?
Oh, it's a pleasure. Nice to hear you.
Okay.
Nice to hear you.
So let me show everybody who that is. There he is right there. That's the man, the myth, the man behind the
My
voice.
apologies.
No problem. It's our special guest. He's here for Corona Money Talk. He is the former host of MSNBC's The Dylan Ratigan Show. He's also a best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author, and a co-host of the popular podcast called Truth or Skepticism on Tasty Trade with Tom Sazanoff. Please welcome Dylan Ratigan back to the show. Dylan, how are you?
Wow. That was you gave me the full Johnny Carson this week.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the best introduction that you've ever done.
No.
I mean, that was the full Burbank.
I know.
Now I feel like I'm a guest on the Jimmy Dore show.
I always apologize for my weak introductions. I should give people better introductions. So thank God I did it
Well,
once.
you're also very good at it, and you live in Burbank, more or less. I mean, for the world's
That's right.
You do.
That's right.
It's called the Jimmy Dore show. I mean, if Jimmy Dore doesn't give you an introduction, who will?
Okay. So Dylan, I just played that video where you presciently predicted the social unrest that happened. And you said what it was going to take was a good punch in the nose, and that's what I'm going to say the George Floyd murder on video was. That was the punch in the nose. And we were talking about, if you remember, we were talking about the mortgage crisis that was coming, and this was predicted in April, right? So I was reading you an old article from April. Well, there's a new article now. It's from CNBC. This is from, let me get the date, June 10th. I was watching Kyle Kalinski's show, and he covered this article. And the headline is, a housing apocalypse is coming as coronavirus protections across the country expire. So did you know this, Dylan, that right now more than 2 million people face eviction every year, which is far greater than the number of people who faced foreclosures at the height of the 2008 mortgage crisis? Did you know that we're in a worse mortgage crisis?
I didn't. I honestly, Jimmy, I didn't. I mean, sadly, I'm not surprised just because of the massive structural nature of the policies that have been put in place. But that's a policy that needs to be changed, obviously. Let's be honest. I mean, it's untenable for the credit markets, for people. The whole point of this is going back to the beginning of going back to 2008, going back decades now, 30 years in the making, the banking laws. America has reached an untenable position structurally, which is better to reach it by way of not war than better to get here this way, better to hit rock bottom this way, right, than to do it through some more traumatic event. Because ultimately what we're looking for is a trigger for what would be the modern equivalent of the Marshall Plan, which, whether it's in the debt restructuring, whether it's in the sort of the architecture of what I'll call traditional conservative populism, blended with the awareness of the logic of a universal healthcare system at a time when people need to adapt quickly to a rapidly changing world where we don't need human beings to work at insurance companies. We need some people to administer the robots, and then we need to be creating jobs that empower people to work with other people, because Andrew Yang is right. The vast majority of the functions that are insurance or that are these sort of current apparatus is obviously fading, and more faster than ever in the context of both the digital cycle and the corruption, which is consolidating all the wealth by owning the digital gateways. So the monopoly on the digital gateways needs to be broken and unfrozen because it's an end game, obviously. And then the workforce needs to be redeployed over time towards human-to-human work, which is, are you healthy? Did you take a walk around the block, Mrs. Johnson? You know, the parole officers that are helping people get a job. I don't mean to sound, fantastical, but I think that the aspiration and the opportunity from the shattering of society that results from biological crisis, followed by economic crisis, followed by social crisis, with the only outstanding crisis now is the financial crisis and a military crisis are the only two that are left on our bingo card. I think 3 is enough. And so the thing is, you want to play bingo 4 ways, you want to play bingo 5 ways. You're lucky you've got 3. You want to cash in your bingo card now for a restructuring, or you want to wait?
Well, the way you get there is you have Nancy Pelosi introduce a goddamn bill that expands Medicare to cover everybody in the United States, and then they have the you just move a couple of decimal points,
Sure.
and everything gets taken care of. That's how you do it. Nancy Pelosi's never
Well, I think
going.
that's the first step, honestly, Jimmy. But if you don't restructure the mandate of the labor force, even if you federalize the whole system today, magic wand,
Okay.
you still have a misallocation of resources that's extremely expensive and focused on intervening on either financial documents or processing documents on computers or around aggressive therapeutics in the pharmaceutical or hospital system. And there's a very low labor force that's focused on healthy humans, which is the entire thesis of Atul Gawande, who's a well-known sort of writer, surgeon, who did a whole set of studies on both creating these jobs and the net effect on overall health costs of the upfront investment in daily intervention for people just to get them to take their diabetes medicine every day in the neighborhood. Literally hiring people, that were working, kids that were working at Dunkin' Donuts, and instead paying them double to go work the neighborhood and check on the people on the list to make sure they're taking a walk around the block, drinking water, and taking their medicine. And it was a 50% reduction in the cost of healthcare.
But isn't the real impediment to that happening the fact that neither party is going to do that?
Yeah, that would be the big.
That was a meatball. That's what they call it, a meatball in the business. That was called a setup.
Well, so
that Biden is there. The fact that Biden is there representing the Democrats now is like proof that will not happen.
Well, he's already vowed that if the House and the Senate pass Medicare for all, he'll veto it. He's already vowed that.
So it's worse. It's worse.
Yes,
it's worse.
It's worse than you
I
think.
thought.
That and now right now Bernie Sanders is running around the country or trying to telling everybody that Joe Biden is the answer to our problems instead of actually trying to push for an actual answer to our problems. Listen, there's a little bit more to this article. Let me get to it before we go on, okay?
Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem. So I don't know. So just getting back to this mortgage crisis, this article at CNBC says between March 25th and April 10th of this year, nearly half of renters aged 18 to 64 reported that they were having trouble paying their rent or utilities, were food insecure, or couldn't afford needed medical care, according to the urban. So in the United States of America, the richest country in the history of the world, half of renters aged 18 to 64 couldn't meet their bills. Half of all renters 18 to 64. About 25% of Black and Latino renters reported not paying or deferring rent in May, and 14% of white renters. Now, evicting people in the middle of a global health crisis puts them at greater risk of contracting and spreading COVID-19, turning a catastrophe into an apocalypse, according to Aaron Carr, who's the founding and executive director of the Housing Rights Initiatives. A lot of people could be on the streets, especially in places like New York City that already have a homeless problem. It could turn into a homeless nightmare. The crisis this is what it requires: a large-scale government response. And if the state and local governments don't step in to help soon, there will be a tsunami of evictions and a spike in homelessness nationwide that will devastate not just individuals and their communities, but the economy broadly. Now, more than ever, housing is healthcare. So, Dylan, they're calling it a foreclosure tsunami that's coming. So, if the punch in the face was the George Floyd, what is this going to be?
I mean, again, we've been treating this very matter-of-factly since March. Biological crisis means you stay home, wear a mask, all the things everybody's adapted to. The lockdowns and the virus have all hyper-targeted a specific population of the United States, which tends to have less money and tends to be overrepresented by minorities, because both the virus and the economic crisis directly assaults the day labor workforce, the service infrastructure workforce, and that workforce is forced to live in cities in close quarters, and the virus is most dangerous in cities with close quarters. which then makes the lockdown actually for them counterproductive by forcing everybody to stay inside and spread the virus when they could be outside wearing masks. And so when you lay what you just described, which is the foreclosure crisis, it's I look at it like raising the temperature to the point that's going to have to force this Marshall Plan. In other words, the bills aren't going to get paid. That will create a hole in the financial system. Powell is running the dollar till he's blue in the face. At some point, the world will have to say something. And ultimately, the one thing we have to remember is every other country in this world, to one degree or another, is corrupted by the same forces that plague us here. And in many of those countries, it's much worse, like Brazil, where hundreds of millions of dollars are going into the government and they never get allocated at all. The end game for that is complete capture of all the resources, total harvesting, which is what the policy here is moving toward, which ultimately the United States needs to reverse in a way that has leadership that transcends both of these political parties, which is how you and I met in the first place. And maybe the foreclosure crisis creates the temperature required. Sometimes you have to heat the crucible.
Right? It does. I think if those people, as a result of this foreclosure tsunami, end up on the street with everyone else who are rightfully protesting for change in the policing structure, I think then you get a populist uprising, you get a big coalition, and they demand that the parties respond or create a third party. And now's the time to do it. So it's sad to see a foreclosure tsunami coming down the pipe, or pike, or whatever the word is. But the only positive thing could be that it puts people literally on the street to demand some change. And then you have true social unrest, and you have kind of a revolution.
What do you think about that idea, Jimmy, that all this energy, if you were to transmute this energy into its most constructive impulse, as opposed to self-destruction and annihilation and rage, which is the most likely path for all unmanaged or unconscious rage, however justifiable?
I just think like one of the coolest things that I remember reading about and learning about, because I'm a Canadian, so I'm learning about America. I've been here for 22 years, but still learning. The greatest anecdote of the civil rights movement and the war on poverty that was declared in the 60s, I guess, first by the Kennedys and then picked up by other people and kind of, mishandled in a way. But the coolest anecdote was the Black Panthers from Oakland ended up in West Virginia and the Appalachians to meet with church groups and local poor white people and to say, we have the same problems. And they were like, oh, shit, yeah, we do.
What do you think about the torched earth of destruction, of the blowtorch, of the triple crisis whammy that we've now sustained, unlike any time in the history of the world, as warm fuel for a new political party that is in favor of a short list of things, starting with healthcare?
Well, exactly to Eddie's point about. He tells a story about when white working class and colored working class people of color figured out that they had more in common because they needed to fight against the establishment and the 1%. That also happened with Fred Hampton in Chicago, and the FBI immediately killed him. So this is not a new idea, but I think right now it's actually a viable idea, right? Because if you look at those protests, It's not just black people out in the streets. I think white people are now getting the message. The middle class people who are no longer in the middle class, and this is exactly what Dylan and I had been trying to figure out. What is it going to take? How many more crises are we going to be able to put up with before people actually get in the street and demand a revolution? Because it was obvious voting's not going to make it happen, and our government, the elected leaders, aren't going to make it happen. It's only going to happen if people get in the streets, and we thought it wouldn't happen because there's a pandemic right now. Well, it turns out people were more willing to go get a virus and die than they were to fucking let the government put their boot on their neck any longer. So maybe this foreclosure, because the fact that 2 million people a year face foreclosure and not one goddamn politician's been fucking talking about it, and it happened every year under goddamn Barack Obama. It is nuts. So yes, I'm hoping that this again is another punch in the face that even makes these protests bigger, right? Because there isn't enough National Guard to call in against a 60,000 crowd. You can't do anything. There's 60,000 people in the streets. That's over, right? Or if there's 100,000 people, you can't do anything to them. So again,
But the only question I would say is to myself, to Eddie, to you, to anybody listening to this, to all the protesters, it is easy to know what to be against, and it has never been easier to be horrified, as everything is horrifying, nothing less so than the George Floyd video and that history of that abuse and murder that's been tolerated since the history of this country. I would say that to have true success with the movement and with a party, there's something valuable about transmuting that energy to demanding the police reforms or reallocation of what policing is. Again, using the health insurance metaphor with policing as an attentive event that is providing violent security as a last result for the whatever it is, 1% to 5%, probably maximum, not really less, of actual violence requiring interactions. And the rest is drunk guys in the parking lot or people stuck in a tree or, other sort of social violations, and social functions. Anyway, my point is that there's an opportunity for a party to really ultimately be a single issue party here. That I think the most collective and inclusive thing and the most fundamentally problematic thing for the United States of America globally as an apparatus, period, is the inability to provide efficient, flexible, quality health care to everybody in this country. That's actually quite easily done. There's brilliant people that have already been doing it around us in our country and around the world. And it's simply a matter of doing more. The reason people resist Medicare for All is because it leaves the calcified system in place and simply funds it from the taxpayer, continuing to pay double the world's value and prioritize all the wrong functions around sickness and technology. You need to pair the movement of the budget to the federal level to a functionality and a set of, let's say, experiments from one city to the next, different functions or different systems, and see, sort of measure them and then expand them. There's a way to go through this process that's really smart, that's not below our level of competency as a country.
Well, historically, third parties have been organized around issues, right? And then they get absorbed into and so then the one of the major parties have to absorb that party and their ideas. And so
you get like three planks from this sort of Corona coalition.
Right. The Republican Party, I think,
police reform, healthcare, and then UBI, or so. And the thing is, you want to be the most easy for everybody to believe in. UBI can still be somewhat divisive because there's different levels of perspective and information. I tend to look at benefits through the lens of the Japanese government, who's done the mathematical calculation that paying universal benefits, whether it's healthcare, education, UBI, whatever, is much cheaper for the budget of the taxpayer to provide as a universal benefit, regardless of economic or class or of these various qualifications, because the benefit and the lack of cost associated with the fracturing and warring that occurs over who gets what in selective benefits. Why does this person get it? This person doesn't get it. This person gets it. I want to get it. We need it more. I need it more. It creates a whole economy that the Japanese take off the table by just setting a foundation that is how they deal with benefits, which I think is valuable to sort of understand, but I'm sure is too philosophical for a campaign.
Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?